I was on console when the shift began, seated where I had been dozens of times before, surrounded by screens that were already familiar enough to fade into the background. Telemetry scrolled at a steady pace. The numbers were ordinary. Voltages sat where we expected them to sit. Oxygen tank pressures were stable. Nothing in the room suggested that the night would be different from any other. The spacecraft was on its way to the moon, and our role was to watch it continue doing exactly what it had been doing for hours. The call-outs were routine, communications were clear, environmental readings were nominal. When the crew spoke, their voices came through cleanly, without urgency. I logged values as they came in, noting small fluctuations the way we always did, comparing them against expected ranges, checking for drift that might indicate an issue developing slowly. There was no reason to think anything was wrong. If there had been, it would have shown itself first in the numbers. Then a reading shifted in a way that didn't fit. One value moved outside the pattern we had been seeing, just enough to make me look at the screen a second time. I waited for the next data point, assuming it would correct itself. Instead, another reading followed it, slightly out of alignment. Not enough to trigger a system warning, but enough to interrupt the rhythm of what we were used to seeing. I checked the display again, then looked to the adjacent console to see if the same change was reflected there. It was. The numbers weren't wrong, but they didn't agree with each other the way they were supposed to. I called it out, calmly, the same way we called out anything that didn't match expectation. No one reacted immediately. That was normal. Small inconsistencies happened, and most of them resolved on their own. Another update came in. This time, the difference was larger. Still no alarm. Still no failure indication. But the trend was becoming harder to ignore. We asked for a routine procedure to be performed, something that should have produced a predictable response in the readings. When the data returned, it didn't match the response we expected. At that point, the room became quieter. Not silent, but more focused. Conversations narrowed. Controllers leaned closer to their screens. I began cross-checking values manually, comparing them against earlier logs, looking for any indication that the sensors themselves might be at fault. If it was instrumentation, the solution was straightforward. If it wasn't, we needed to know quickly. The crew reported a physical sensation aboard the spacecraft. They described it without emphasis, as an observation rather than a complaint. That was when the shift in the room became noticeable. A physical event meant that what we were seeing was not limited to telemetry. Something had happened on the vehicle itself. The numbers were no longer abstract. Power readings changed next. Not all at once, and not in a way that pointed cleanly to a single cause. One system showed a drop. Another showed an increase that didn't align with load changes. We ran through the expected explanations, eliminating them one by one. Each time, the data refused to settle into a pattern we recognized. I remember realizing that we were no longer dealing with a minor anomaly. The procedures we were referencing assumed stable systems. The checklists we pulled up were written for conditions that no longer applied. We were still calm, still methodical, but the assumptions underneath our work were starting to erode. A report came in that oxygen pressure was falling, not fast, but steadily. That should not have been happening. We confirmed it through multiple channels, then confirmed it again. The value continued to decline. At the same time, electrical readings tied to that system began to shift. The link between them was obvious, but the cause was not. I looked around the room and saw the same realization spreading quietly. No one said it out loud yet, but we were all thinking the same thing. This was not a single failed component. This was a chain, and we were only seeing part of it. The spacecraft was still responding to commands. Communications were still intact, but the margin we relied on was shrinking. We informed the flight director of the confirmed trends. The language was careful. We described what we knew, not what we feared. He acknowledged it and asked for options. We did not have options yet. We had questions. As more data arrived, one fact became unavoidable. The system we depended on to support the crew was no longer stable. Whatever had happened was still happening. And for the first time since launch, we could not say with confidence that the mission was proceeding as planned. That was the moment we knew something was wrong. Once that realization set in, the work changed. We were no longer monitoring a mission in progress. We were managing a situation that was evolving faster than our documentation could keep up with. The numbers continued to update, and with each update, the picture became clearer and more troubling. Oxygen pressure dropped further. Power availability narrowed. The relationship between systems was no longer theoretical. We were watching cause and effect unfold in real time. We shifted focus to preservation. Every calculation now revolved around how long systems could continue operating under the conditions we were observing. The spacecraft had been designed with redundancy, but redundancy assumed isolated failures. What we were seeing did not fit that model. Each adjustment affected something else. Conserving power meant limiting instrumentation. Limiting instrumentation reduced visibility. Every decision carried a cost. The crew followed instructions exactly as given. Their voices remained steady, even as the procedures we sent up became more frequent and more restrictive. We asked them to power down equipment that had never been turned off during flight before. Each shutdown stabilized one system while placing additional strain on another. There was no ideal configuration, only temporary balances. As the situation progressed, the moon ceased to be the objective. That change was not announced dramatically. It simply became clear through the way our conversations shifted. Trajectory calculations were reworked. The question was no longer how to reach the destination, but how to remain viable long enough to return. That required rethinking how the spacecraft would be used in ways it had not been designed for. The data coming in confirmed what we already suspected. Oxygen was not being replenished. Power was finite. Heat levels fluctuated as systems were cycled on and off. We tracked each change, logging it carefully, knowing that every value mattered. There was no single screen that told the whole story. We had to assemble it piece by piece. At no point did the room descend into chaos. The urgency was real, but it expressed itself through concentration, not noise. People spoke when they had something to add. Silence filled the spaces in between. We were no longer waiting for confirmation of a failure. We were working inside one. The spacecraft continued on its trajectory, now following a path that would allow it to loop around the moon rather than land on it. This maneuver was discussed, calculated, verified, and executed without ceremony. It was necessary. As hours passed, the environment aboard the spacecraft deteriorated. Temperatures dropped, condensation formed. The crew reported discomfort, but they reported it the same way they reported everything else, as information rather than complaint. We adjusted plans accordingly, factoring in human limits alongside mechanical ones. Every decision was provisional. We knew that conditions would change again, and soon. We stayed ahead of them where we could, reacting quickly where we couldn't. The systems continued to function, but only just. The margin was gone. Everything depended on maintaining a fragile equilibrium until Earth came back within reach. By the time we could say with certainty that the spacecraft would return, we were already exhausted. The kind of focus required to operate under those conditions does not come with relief when the danger passes. It lingers. When the mission finally ended, there was no sense of triumph in the room. There was only the quiet acknowledgement that we had been closer to failure than the numbers alone could express. The systems had not behaved the way they were designed to. The procedures had not anticipated what occurred. And the only reason the outcome changed was because we adapted while the situation was still unfolding. That understanding stayed with me long after the consoles were powered down. The mission was aborted, and the crew returned to Earth on April 17, 1970. What followed was no longer part of my role to describe. This is where my account ends.